room and coming into YouTube. So I think we can start now. First, a very warm welcome, Charles. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. I have to admit that I kind of tricked you by sending you a photo where we met in the Worldcon in Helsinki. And I don't know if you remember the very intense discussion we had on the hallway. Like, Charlie, can I take a selfie with you?
I had a lot of very intense discussions at that Worldcon.
So I just sent Charlie the selfie over and said, do you still remember me? Can you come to the festival? And I wanted to have you over for years now. And we've been doing the Nürnberg Digital Festival for years. But I mean, in the normal setting, it's a lot of work. And I think nothing is more. And your travel page is very explicit about the time you need.
Well, I would have loved to have come this year, but COVID-19 hit. Yeah. I've been going slowly stir crazy for about 3 years now because sad news is over the last few years, I've lost both my parents. Now, to be fair, they were over 90, but my father died in 2017. Then my mother got ill and was in a nursing home for over a year and died last year. And just as I was beginning to look forward to being able to go away from the UK for plan for more than a month at a time or get away from it all, suddenly COVID-19 locks everything down again. So I'm still stuck in my apartment, being bitten by the miscreant you see in the background behind me.
Yeah, I'm very sorry about that. That's a sad story, and
it's a booby prize we get for living long enough.
That's true.
I mean, I'm kind of grateful that they lived to a good old age, and I was over 50 by the time I had to deal with it, so had enough emotional maturity to cope. It's absolutely terrible to have to deal with that sort of thing when you're a youngster.
And there are a lot of people who have to deal with it this year due to the pandemic. I think everybody who is here in the room knows you, but still, Charles Stross, one of the most renowned science fiction writers, I think, at the moment. You have been writing about from the singularity to demons to code about practically everything. And you've been a programmer, which is for the Digital Festival, of course, active in open source on the Linux as an editor, as a writer, which is we have a very big open source community they started the festival with us. So you've always been on my short list for people who match every audience and every interest we have between science fiction, technology, open source, and digital communication and everything we have.
Well, thanks. I will say I feel slightly inadequate hearing that list because looking at the calendar, I suddenly realized, my God, it's been 20 years since I last worked as a developer. And, that's kind of Stone Age territory now.
Yeah. And you've been a blogger since 2003, you just said.
Running my own blog, since then. Yeah. Which I started blogging about a month after Bruce Sterling declared that blogging was dead. He's always been a decade ahead of everybody else in the science fiction field.
Yeah.
In fact, if you wonder who science fiction writers look to for models.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Bruce Sterling, he always gives a great talk at South by Southwest in Austin. And last year he talked about, last year he talked about that we need more tech art festivals and less business festival. So we took that as an inspiration and planned a tech art festival for this July, but that didn't really work out. So now here we are in the remote festival. I think we're going to talk a bit about the world, what's happening currently on the world stage, then shift over to your books and to your new book, which has just come out, Dead Lies Dreaming. And just to give you a start, I asked you, you've been working from the home office for how long now?
20 years.
20 years.
That's full-time 20 years. I mean, I was working part-time out of a home office for close to 10 years before that. What gave me the push to go full-time was changing job during the dot-com 1.0 bust in 2000. I'd been working for a startup in Edinburgh, a startup which no longer exists because they won the prize. We were a payment service provider processing credit card transactions over the internet in the early days. And I think you can fairly describe it as game over, you won, roll the closing credits, if the company is acquired by MasterCard and turned into an internal division making EPOS software. But that was a lot later. And in early 2000, our CEO was in a desperate race to raise money, go public, and cash out as fast as he could. The developers didn't come out of it anything like as well as you might expect if you've been following stories from America. But then again, this is the UK, and the techies always get screwed. Anyway, I was getting a bit dissatisfied at the time. And I was talking to a friend of mine who was running an ISP in the UK. And he made me a job offer that was too good to refuse. He wanted to set up, he was going public, he wanted to set up a software development wing and wanted me to run it. I should add, I was programmer number one at the payment service provider Data Cash back in the day. And I was on 3 months' notice to quit. So I was working through my notice when, oops, the bubble burst. And they didn't really want me on the premises at the office if I was leaving anyway. So I was at home, and I phoned up one day to talk to Andrew, the CEO, and who? Him? Oh, we fired him last week. Job? What job? We don't know who you are. Go away. So that was a bit of a bad moment for me. Luckily, for about 5 or 6 years, I'd been writing for a British magazine, Computer Shopper, doing the Linux and open source column. And the fact that I had this existing column and was doing feature articles in a magazine helped, because also in 2000, a number of Linux magazines were starting up. So I was able to just email or phone the editors and say, hi, I'm available for work. Do you have any commissions for me? And I went from, I guess, part-time side hustle writing a monthly column about Linux to full-time open source computer journalist in about 2 months flat. Which sort of tided me over because the next year, my first novel was bought. And about 4 or 5 years down the line, print publications were destroyed by internet advertising because they all relied on advertising sales to justify the paper costs. But by the time the writing was on the wall, I had another job lined up as a novelist. But it was slipping from being full-time working at home doing freelance tech journalism with essentially a computer lab in my spare room to full-time novelist over about 5 to 10 years.
So 20 years in the home office? What did you learn? What can you give our attendees as an advice for the next 20 years?
Several things, but trying to disentangle them from the business of being full-time freelance takes a bit of work. For example, if you're going to get a job as a novelist, don't do it until you have a year's gross income in your savings account, because you'll be paid very, very irregularly in strange-sized lumps. 20 euros 1 month and 20,000 euros 3 months later and nothing in between, that sort of thing. Having said that, you can't really do this unless you have space. Even if you're comfortable working on a laptop or a tablet, and I'm a little bit old school, I have far too many books hidden behind this photograph of my cat. You need a bit of elbow room or you'll go stir crazy. And I in turn got a piece of advice from another successful novelist, and she'd been working at home since I think the early 1980s. And in the early 1990s, she told me, if you ever go full time, make time for a social life and build it around your friends' free hours. Your friends probably have day jobs. They probably have a 9 till 5 office job. They won't be available at the points when you particularly want to socialize because you're not working, because you do all your work at 10 p.m. on a Saturday night. Build your life around other people or you'll go mad. And she was absolutely right, and I've gone mad.
Yeah. So
especially in the current climate when I just can't go out.
Yeah.
Sorry?
So use the flexibility wisely. So
yeah.
I think that's a good advice. Many people who struggle with it at the moment. And we had a lot of sessions, I think, where people were talking about it. So I lead it with this. As a science fiction writer, how did you feel about the last year? What surprised you the most? What was...
The stupidity of it all. I think it was either Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels who said, history repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce. I'd amend farce to stupidity. The fact that Donald Trump has in theory been shown the exit from the White House is very positive, but I'm living in the UK and I'm just contemplating the utter, am I allowed to swear? The utter shit show that is Brexit. And it just makes me want to weep. It was a really bad idea to begin with, and they're doing it in the worst possible manner imaginable, even if they're going to do it. I mean, you take a stupid idea and you double down on it. I mean, sorry, I'm kind of speechless at the idiocy of it. It already completely derailed a novel of mine because discursive thing about a particular book. I have a long-running series of bureaucratic comedy, spy thriller, Lovecraftian horror novels called The Laundry Files. There's a bit of a mashup there. The British Secret Civil Service Department for protecting us from Cthulhu and similar monsters. And in book 8, the Delirium Brief, I began writing it in 2015. And the idea was, I was going to go for a little bit of political satire. The laundry has been exposed to the public by having failed to prevent a particularly nasty occult disaster. It opens with our protagonist, Bob Howard, and we're talking a spook, basically, being grilled live on the BBC's flagship news and current affairs programme because he's about to go up in front of the House of Commons into a public inquiry. Lois McMaster Budgell once gave the advice, work out what the worst possible thing you can do to your protagonist is and then do it. And for Bob, it was very obviously be put on the spotlight in public. Mm-hmm. And the idea I came up with was, okay, the British government is here. They're as corrupt as a British government is this century, I'm afraid to say. What would they do if they discovered a new, large, and hitherto secret department of the government? Answer, they'd set it up for privatization so they could cash out. And they have ways and means of doing this. There's a standard protocol for how you sell off the air traffic control system of a post office or the railways. As I said, British governments this century, amazingly corrupt. And it's the sort of corruption that doesn't involve handing over envelopes stuffed with 500 euro notes. It's all about outsourcing to the private sector stuff that is best done by government. And then somehow a year later, the minister who did that has left the government and is now on the board of directors of the company who are doing the job, which is making bank. Anyway, I decided a good plot would be the laundry is set up for privatization. And I wrote this nice sort of political comedy thriller, taking a rather bleak look at the way a British government does business. I sort of completed it and it felt a little bit flat. And then the Brexit referendum happened. And I was wandering around in a daze for a week because the UK was hit by 3 different constitutional crises the same week. And I suddenly realized everything I had written in that book was far too understated and mild. I mean, it wasn't remotely crazy enough. So I had to go back, tear it up and rewrite it in such a way that it actually stood up to real life. And since then, I've been trying to run with this series. And back in 2016, I thought it would be entirely future-proof in terms of satire to put a Lovecraftian elder god in number 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister, Nyarlathotep, the Black Pharaoh, the crawling chaos. It doesn't get much crazier than that, does it? Well, unfortunately, they're doing their best to do so. I mean, we've got Boris Johnson in number 10 Downing Street. Who ordered that? So just trying to keep one jump ahead of the real world is, well, you can see how much hair I've torn out.
Is this something you felt in a lot of possible books or other situations over the last year, that there's we've gone too crazy to write?
Yeah, I'm getting email from readers who've been reading my recent books and saying they're reading them as happy, fun, comfort reading. These are sort of nightmarish dystopias where people are being sacrificed to tentacle monsters. There's a different series where the United States has descended into a nightmarish dystopian police state, the Empire Games trilogy. And yeah, people are reading that as comforting because there's a reason for the paranoia, and the president is basically benign and competent.
Mm. Yeah, I can see where they're coming from.
Anything is better than the stupidity of it all.
Yeah. Has this changed a lot in your perspective? So as a science fiction writer looking at the world, you always imagine where could it go? What could happen? What does AI actually mean when I upload my mind into the festival or something? What does happen there? Has your perspective for the future changed now?
Well, I'm 20 years older than when I began selling novels. So, of course, middle-aged guy's perspective rather than young, energetic guy who's just come off a dot-com death march perspective. So, yeah, I have changed a bit. Part of it is historical context. I'm old enough now to remember what people think of as historical events during my time. For example, I remember when Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister in the UK, or when the Berlin Wall came down. And this sort of informs what I perceive in what's going on. I do have a paranoid theory about the current political climate globally and what it's all about. Mind if I try it on you?
Absolutely.
Okay. Geopolitics is dictated by energy economics, is the big picture. Go back before about 1780 and Thomas Malthus and his thesis on population dynamics and economics, and the limit to the population is dictated by how much food you can grow, and the population dictates what you can build because it's entirely manual labor plus the odd water wheel. But then after about 1780, we began to see the Industrial Revolution, the development of steam engines, and this changed an awful lot of things, starting with textile manufacturing, then propulsion, then, well, transatlantic steamships, steam locomotives, entirely new ways of waging warfare, unfortunately. Now, prior to the steam engine, economics was dictated by population, which was dictated by how many crops you can grow. So it was climate-based. With the steam engine, yes, you had to be able to mine coal and iron, or you didn't have much scope for industrialization. But if you could do that, you could go a lot further. And the result of this was a deeply, deeply destabilizing impact on the global politics of the 19th century. Now, then we go a bit further forward. There was an event in 1905 to 1906, the Russo-Japanese War, in which a Russian foreign minister, having dealt with the 1905 revolution, proposed to the Tsar, what this country needs is a short, victorious war so we can all rally around the flag. So they picked a fight with Japan. This was not very clever. They lost. One of the sideshows to that fight was the most ridiculous naval campaign in recent military history. The Japanese, in a surprise attack, destroyed the Russian Far Eastern fleet and besieged Port Arthur in the far east of Siberia. So the Russian Baltic fleet sailed all the way around Europe and Africa and across the Indian Ocean to attack Japan. And this was in the days of coal-powered steam warships. And it was an absolutely ridiculous campaign, never mind the incident in which the Russian fleet opened fire on the British trawler fleet in the North Sea and nearly started World War I a decade early. They had to refuel at sea. They transferred more than 1/3 of a million tons of coal in about 50 ship-to-ship refuelings and demonstrated to everybody's satisfaction that, one, you can send a battleship all the way around the world so the Japanese Navy can have it for target practice, and two, doing it with coal is stupid. Now, the British Royal Navy at the time was the dominant naval force on the planet, and they saw this and thought, what if we had a more convenient fuel than coal? How about heavy oil? We could burn oil and power turbines, and you can pump oil from ship to ship quite easily. But, you know, the UK back then didn't have any oil, which is why they picked on Persia and why we've got this horrible catastrophic involvement in the Middle East that's been going now for 100 years. That's what fueled the battleship race and its successor, modern mechanized industrial warfare. And this in turn was dictated by the geographical distribution of oil and natural gas, which is not in the same places as coal, but with oil and natural gas, you can go a lot further than you can with coal. So again, the balance of power changed. The British Empire had been a thalassic empire, a seagoing empire. Ships were able to put in at ports. Use of oil allowed the United States to do the same thing and pretty much took over from Great Britain after Britain and Germany were bankrupted during the 1940s. But now we're going into yet another era. Nuclear power didn't really work out as a successor to coal and oil. It's too expensive, has too many infrastructure problems with rolling it out, and it's not very mobile. You can't really build it into a ship any smaller than a heavy cruiser, and you don't want to be building it into privately owned freight ships. Solar panels, however, changed the game again, just as much as the shift from agriculture to coal shifted geopolitics. Photovoltaic panels now cost less per kilowatt hour to manufacture than coal mined out of existing mines being fed into existing coal burning power stations. It's undercutting the entire energy market worldwide. Also, the geographical distribution.
Accelerating this year. So.
Yep, it's going very, very fast. Coal plants are beginning to shut down worldwide. The UK closed its last coal burning power station last year, I think. A station that was only built in the mid-1970s and supplied 5 or 6 gigawatts, 10% of the UK's electricity consumption, and it's no longer economical to maintain it. Now, solar power is most efficient near the equator because you've got higher insolation per unit area. You don't have long winter nights with no sunlight. It's pretty evenly distributed around the year. And the slant angle through the atmosphere means you don't lose energy that's being absorbed in the air. So the countries that are going to pick up revenue from the solar power boom are going to be those near the equator, typically in Africa, in East Asia, in Central and South America. But solar power isn't really very portable. You can find ways to turn the energy into something that is portable, for example, by smelting aluminum and exporting it. Iceland is doing that successfully using geothermal power from its volcanoes. But solar power isn't inherently portable, at least as we have it today. So again, I predict the balance of power is going to change drastically over the next century. And another corollary of this is the assets in the ground consisting of coal and oil are going to be worthless within 10 years. So what we're seeing now is essentially a mafia bust out conducted by old fossil fuel industries. They are trying to maximize their revenue by mining out all their available assets as fast as they can, while those assets are still worth something close to their book value. The culture wars, the right-wing noise machines, Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, Brexit, all this stuff, it's a distraction. There are think tanks funded by Charles Koch, by Mercer, by Peter Thiel, by various right-wing billionaires, who are all heavily invested in petrochemical stuff. And the objective of the think tanks isn't to create some kind of vast right-wing takeover of the planet. It is simply to distract us and prevent us from moving off carbon fuels as fast as possible. Because every year when we're not moving off carbon fuels, they're making tens of billions, hundreds of billions even in profits that will not be available in future. It's just pure stupid self-interest. So the combination of our current extreme political climate that's been induced deliberately as cover for profit-taking and a clearly impending shift to an entirely new form of geopolitics is going to create the climate against which, sorry, that wasn't an intentional pun, the climate against which science fiction set in the next couple of centuries needs to be written. And it's going to be a very different looking world.
I think that's not much of a conspiracy theory. It's proven again and again. The show about conservative supreme judges in the US. And I actually have some relatives and friends who come from families with that background, and they all believe in that. So why is it, I think that's an interesting point, but why do people, let's say in the US, have a hard time believing that and have an easy time believing the stuff QAnon uses as a conspiracy theory, which could be out of a Stross book, a certain Stross book?
I think it's actually warmed over versions of Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Scher's Illuminatus trilogy from the 1970s. And if you go back before that, it has taproots into the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a notorious fabrication by a Tsarist secret police officer, which in turn informed Hitler. I think they find this easy to believe because the world is really complex. It's actually difficult to get a handle on what's really going on, especially when you're in a media bubble where the media is entirely privately owned by, again, right-wing press oligarchs, many of whom have investments in other industries, in fossil fuels. We also have an issue. People become the sunk cost fallacy. If you've sunk a certain amount of effort into pursuing a course of action, you want to carry on with it. People have a huge emotional sunk cost investment in the world is the way it already is. Yes, we can drive our pickup trucks and our cars endlessly. We can live in sprawling suburban mansions. There can't be anything wrong with this. Why would we want to drive a much smaller car or ride a bicycle and live in an apartment in the center of town? That's not nice. We don't have an elbow room there. So they're trying to find, they're always searching for justifications for why they don't need to adapt to climate change or take remedial action. And they've got a media environment that feeds from excuses. Let's not forget the role of the Murdoch family, whose newspapers and TV channels, they started out in Australia. They were providing, I guess, public relations service to the large mining combines who pretty much dominate Australian politics. There's not really any independent left-wing press left in Australia, and it's a side effect of it. And we shouldn't be too surprised that the big internet-based oligopolies such as Facebook, Twitter, Google, Apple to a much lesser extent because they're primarily a hardware company, but still to some extent Apple, these companies are very much in bed with the status quo. They sell advertising. To maximize advertising, they need to get the advertisers to go to give them money, and they need to keep their readers engaged. Nothing generates emotional engagement on social media like outrage and hatred. It's far more effective at generating advertising click-throughs than emotional warm fuzzies. So we have a really toxic stew of media, including an awful lot of consolidation and centralization. The World Wide Web back in 2000 was a very different place from what it is today, where it's dominated by about 3 or 4 large monopolies. Yeah, there's still private blogs, there's still external stuff. But if you were to ask Mark Zuckerberg about blogs, he'd just shrug and say, who cares? It's 1%.
No clicks there.
Yeah. Excuse me a second. I'm getting a little bit hoarse from talking, so I need a bit more tea.
This is so the core question of our interview was: are we in dystopian times? Do you think we already are there? Or will it get worse?
We have been in dystopian times for the past 200 or 300 years. To anybody who doesn't live in Europe or North America or the developed world.
That's true. Yeah.
What we are seeing happening politically in the United States and in the UK in particular, Germany has mostly avoided this, is the application of a particular type of business practice and politics, very intertwined, called disaster capitalism, which Naomi Klein wrote a book about some years ago called The Shock Doctrine. Now, disaster capitalism was rolled out most obviously in Chile after the coup d'etat in 1973, where General Pinochet shoved through a new constitution and pretty much privatized the entire state where possible, and passed laws banning the state from setting up new enterprises and competing with the free market, but so-called free market. The idea was to allow commercial incumbents to thrive, or rather that was the avowed policy. The real purpose of this was to allow cronies to make bank and steal everything that wasn't nailed down. We saw it again recently in Russia after 1991, the rise of the oligarchs over the next 10 years and the complete misrule and privatization of everything. Ordinary people starving in the street and billionaires driving Lamborghinis around. It explains an awful lot about our current world order. Now, this was very much the norm for how colonized nations were ruled by imperial powers, if you go back a century and a half. What happened? Decolonization of European powers after the Second World War meant they couldn't pull those tricks as effectively anymore. But the techniques were still applicable if you could convince a local government in a developing world nation to provide the environment in which you could steal everything and then sell it back to the public effectively. And you do that by cultivating a local political elite and getting them on your side and then fabricating some sort of disaster. It could be an earthquake, it could be a volcanic eruption, it could be a coup. Whatever, the disaster is a pretext for bringing the private sector in to fix things, or so they say. And I see a lot of what's going on, Trump and Brexit, as symptoms of this. It's very visible currently in the United Kingdom in the handling of COVID-19, where England has done disastrously badly, the worst country in Europe in terms of death rates, doing nearly as bad as the United States. Contact tracing is a very effective and necessary way of preventing the spread of a pandemic. Like pretty much everyone, the British government set up a contact tracing scheme. I should say the English government, because the devolved nations have responsibility for their own health affairs and have generally done somewhat better. Anyway, the English contact tracing scheme was outsourced 100% to Serco Service Corporation, a major government outsourcing contractor. And they spent more than 10, 12 billion pounds setting up a nationwide contact tracing database that's less than 50% effective at tracing contacts. And furthermore, its computer system ran into huge problems and crashed last month because it couldn't cope with the exponentiating rise in COVID-19 cases due to a second wave. I mean, how do you spend 12 billion pounds contact tracing a nation of 50 million?
In Germany, the debate was about the cost of 20 million for the, or I think it's 70 million at the end for the COVID app.
Yeah. So, well, Scotland is doing somewhat better on both contact tracing and on death toll. Not that much better because we're on the same landmass, we share a border and a free trade zone. And more importantly, the Scottish government doesn't have enough independent power to set up a furlough scheme to pay people who are laid off work due to restrictions without getting permission from London. The result is restrictions on movement and working had to be agreed with the London government, who were bizarrely incompetent at it. I don't want to specifically go off on a rant about Boris Johnson and his stupidity at this point, because we'll be here for the next 48 hours if I get started and my throat will hurt. Just take it as read. They're not very good at being a government. They're better at public relations. I mean, Boris was appointed prime minister on a simple slogan: "Get Brexit done." I have no idea what they've done, but it's just it's glorified public relations. And as I said, I'm kind of speechless about it.
Let me lead you back a bit to your books.
Sorry.
Let me lead you back a bit to your books. Do you think science fiction currently has a specific role? Or, I mean, there were different times in science fiction. I think the cyberpunk area, so to speak. Then we had, or is it what you first said, the changing world order? To tell this story a bit.
Okay, firstly, I don't think we can say that science fiction has a purpose any more than France has a purpose. It just is. The purpose of the thing is what it does. As cybernetics pioneer, whose name I'm going blank on, commented, Stanford Beer. The purpose of the thing is what it does. Now, there are many people writing stuff that is pigeonholed as science fiction that goes off in radically different directions. In fact, it's really just a marketing term that booksellers and publishers apply to tell people where to find what they want to read. You know, it's shelved with other stuff that's similar. Having said that, I try to think part of my purpose is social commentary, and fiction is in general entertaining and illuminating lies about the human condition that shed light into areas where we can't actually open a newspaper and look at reportage of what's going on. And what I try to do is shed light on some of the, I guess, emotional and psychological undercurrents propelling where we're going now. In the Empire Games trilogy, I was very much looking at multipolar superpower paranoia and the war on terror, but in the context of parallel universes where history had taken a very different course. In the Laundry Files, I have lately been going off on a side tangent because I can't write satire about spies in the civil service at the current time. I mean, that's just ludicrous. So I'm currently going off on a tangent that began with Dead Lies Dreaming, in which I'm dealing with ordinary people, well, ordinary criminals, ordinary mad oligarch billionaires who are trying to get along under a magically superpowered dictatorship. Magic in the Laundry Files is sort of like carbon dioxide in the real world in terms of climate change. It's leaking out everywhere. It's changing the climate. It's making it inhospitable for ordinary human beings to survive. But at the same, at the same time, there is more magic out there. There are more people practicing it. Therefore, more entertaining opportunities to illuminate how badly people can make use of the stuff around them and also ignore reality.
Is the new government, so where Dead Lies Dreaming and trilogy happens, is this something you had in mind for a longer time, or is this something that also came from the situation changing?
It came out of Brexit. As I said, in the original draft of blanking on my own book titles is a bad sign. In the original draft of the Delirium Brief, I had this sort of neat satire on privatization. The final redraft, it was a whole lot more savage. And it ends up with a coup d'etat, again, installing a new British government ruled by an elder god. And I began thinking the next book, what's the shape of a government ruled by an absolute eldritch evil being going to look like? Well, it sort of writes itself, because if you look at conservatism for a certain lens, cruelty is the entire point. It's the spectacle of cruelty. You are able to look down on other people who are suffering and feel better about yourself. So strong and stable is the motto of the new management. The new management is this government. They're building a giant chromed rack of skulls on Marble Arch in London, the site of the old Tyburn Gallows Tree, the main execution centre for London in the Middle Ages. They are they're privatizing everything. They have a problem with magic, so they're bringing back an 18th century approach to crime and punishment. They're hiring private sector thief takers to go out and capture wizards and supervillains. And well, of course, they're putting on trial and then executing them if they catch them, but nobody's going to go and catch them unless somebody pays for a thief taker to go after them.
So they are privatizing everything.
They privatized everything, yeah. And that's part of what's going on there. There's also something showing up in the second book in the series, which is de-emphasized persons. Not criminals, just inconvenient people. People who don't contribute enough to society, the long-term seriously disabled, pensioners, incorrigible minor criminals who never do anything bad enough to get sent to prison, but who are a nuisance all the same. After a while, the new management pronounces them de-emphasized. They are de facto outlaws. Dealing with them is not something the government will bother with anymore. They won't be able to claim any kind of social security or health benefits. They'll probably have their bank accounts closed if they have one. They'll be kicked out. They'll be sleeping on the street. And if somebody feels like pouring petrol over them and setting them on fire, it's not a crime. Well, it might be littering. Okay. And, this is fairly clearly where the Conservative Home Secretary we currently have would like to go in dealing with immigration. Because she's a horrible piece of work. And trying to get, well, there's a problem with people whose immigration papers were not in order and awaiting asylum being kicked out on the street and having to try and live on £20 a week in the UK in the middle of a pandemic in winter. Yeah.
So I can see a problem. Reality is becoming a little bit strange, and you have to go a step further in everything you write now.
Yeah, I mean, a constant refrain on my Twitter this year has been today's headline, retweet it with the refrain, "Go home 2020, you're drunk."
Mm.
Nobody would believe that in a book.
Are there questions from the audience? I think there are more people on YouTube than here, but you can feel free to put in a question if you have one. Do you think, I asked this question before in the email, but do you think there's a book upcoming from anybody about arcane election systems? Because I mean, the fascination they have obviously for people for days seems intense.
I will confess that after I heard that Joe Biden had won the popular vote, I went and self-medicated very heavily with a bottle of alcohol.
A good strategy.
Yeah. Elections are a problem we've got. The whole point of democracy as a political system, I think it was Winston Churchill who said that democracy is a terrible system of government. It's just less bad than all the others we know about. I'd like to raise another eminent right-wing asshole British politician who's dead, Enoch Powell, who also observed, every statesman's career ends in failure. Eventually, they either die or they run up against an election that they lose. And the interesting point about democracy is it allows for a peaceful transfer of power. If you have an absolute monarchy and the king goes nuts or loses the mandate of heaven in the Chinese context over crop failures or misrule or loses a war, it's very, very hard to get rid of the monarch. Whereas if you have democratically elected leaders and legislators, they govern by the consent of the governed, and every few years there's an election, and when they lose the consent of the public, eventually they lose their office and somebody else takes over. And this way you can diffuse the social pressures that build up until you have a revolution, which is why democracies generally don't have revolutions as a result of internal stress. They can be induced from outside. The proverbial meddling of the CIA in places such as Chile or Iran or Argentina is just, well, is legendary. But democracies don't generally collapse from within that way. What does happen, though, and what we're getting a crash course on, is if enough people at senior level don't believe in the idea of the will of the people being why they're there, they start to try and rearrange the furniture to make it easier to hang on to power. And when that happens, you get a nation that goes through the motions of democracy. It holds elections every so often, but it isn't really democratic. The Soviets had something a little like this. They had elections, everybody voted. There were parties other than the Communist Party who could stand, but they were sort of allies of the communists. There was not really any choice. And you didn't really want to vote for somebody who was opposing the Communist Party. That would not be a good move. And that's what I mean when I talk about the form of democracy. What we had in the United Kingdom for a long time, since the 1980s, was stretches where you had an institutional ruling party, the Conservative Party, and an insurgent would-be ruling party. And at the point when Tony Blair had been in office for about 5 or 6 years, and the Conservatives had been out of office for 5 or 6 years, Labour was becoming more of a governing party. The Tories were trying desperately hard to look as if they weren't the nasty, unpleasant people we were used to, and they became almost indistinguishable for a while. And when that happens, you have a real problem, because at that point, it's just gamesmanship between parties rather than actual substance. There is no real opposition. Back around 2009, 2010, I was talking about what I saw as the beige dictatorship, which is men and a few women in business suits, all talking the same talk, regardless of what party they're in. No, it doesn't matter who you vote for, the ruling party will win. And I was hoping at that point that somebody would break the deadlock. We'd get some variety because we desperately needed it with climate change and other issues facing us and the global financial crisis. Unfortunately, the deadlock was broken from the right by the neo-fascists. People like Steve Bannon, for example, or Nigel Farage. This does not end well. I just hope to hell that sane opposition gets it together in time to do something.
Okay, I think I have to wrap up now. I want to thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
I want to recommend the new book, Dead Lies Dreaming. I don't think
Let me hold up a couple of copies.
Yeah.
Hang on.
I don't think I spoil anything if I say Santa is dying on page 1. So, as a trespasser and a person not very respectable in the sense of the new management. And
I'm pretty sure I'd be on the Prime Minister's little list of people who can be disposed of.
I hope you will come to a physical event one time to Nürnberg. I'd like to have a very, very long chat then with a very special and a beer with a very special background here.
I'd love to come, but it's not going to happen before we have an effective vaccine.
Absolutely. And we will not have events here before we have an effective vaccine. So, Charles, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time, and especially the double time you had to spend now with.
And thank you to the audience for paying attention to me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank everybody who's here, and I wish you all a great evening. I think we'll have some beer as the next